All right, Nathan, are we on? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, I see nodding heads. We're getting there. Good. We're on. Okay, and we are at 11 o'clock, straight up. Wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful. Ryan, since you're standing and back there, would you open us in prayer? Amen. Thank you. All right. So for the purposes of the tape, everybody watching that comes later, last week's class was abbreviated. We started very late, so that's why it's only 15 minutes. I'm talking straight to the video audience. But this week we'll have a full class, so we're going to take a running start at it. We started a little bit last week. And what we'll do is we're going to begin a little bit where we started last week and cover that again, just so that we can make sure and cover what we need to cover. We are in chapter 5 of this book, Strange New World, Carl Trueman. And the way he describes himself almost is as a professor of historic thought. He covers theological thought and how it's changed over centuries and thousands of years. And what he's getting at with this book, and this book is the shorter version of his longer version book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which is about that thick. This is this book, shorter, Strange New World, covers largely the same topic. It's all of the slipperiness that we're feeling as a culture all around in basically the westernized world. And what he's trying to do is address that slipperiness, address that anxiety, that angst that we feel about the world and about the people in the world and about our modern culture. So we spent these first 4 chapters, Trueman was covering philosophers that impacted us, and we went deep into those philosophers. There was Marx, there was Nietzsche, there was Freud, and then we covered the last one. Somebody help me. Reich, thank you. There's another one in there too. But we covered the last one. And those 4 philosophers basically are great, and we can see that their philosophy flows into our world. But we also recognize that, hey, none of us have ever read those philosophers. And society as a whole has not studied those philosophers and said, yep, this is absolutely the truth, and we're going to live according to this truth. Nobody ever did that. So what Trueman has brought to the front for us is this concept of social imaginary by that Canadian philosopher. And the idea of social imaginary is basically it's our unexamined beliefs that we have that we just operate according to. It's our intuitions. It's our intuitions. And we have to examine our intuitions because our intuitions are being built by things that are non-biblical and also being influenced by the culture, which we've seen over and over again. So with our class today, with chapter 5, and we are going to try to get through the whole chapter this time, there's another moving part. There's another moving piece to the whole equation. So we started out, when we were looking at the philosophers, we're saying that there used to be a mindset that when you were born, you came into the world and you fit in. You learned how you fit into the world. And we made a metaphor here. It said the world is basically a long road. This is the past, all the people that have died in the past. These are the people that are in the present, currently functioning in the world. And this is the future, which hasn't happened. But everything that preceded has led to the world in which we live now, and all the people that are playing all the different roles in this world now. And we all fit together in a certain way. And we're also recognizing that our work here as these as this timeline continues to pass through, we'll stay here. We'll go to heaven or we'll go to hell, but this is going to move forward, and so we're building for the future, for all the people to come. And that has been the understanding of the world, by the world, all the people in the world, since the beginning of the world. Now, what Truman is highlighting is that that's changed since the Enlightenment. When you cut God out of the conversation, then you have to start addressing man's constant pursuit of happiness, which we'll get to later on. We're going to define happiness the old way. But it's that sense of completeness, that sense of harmony. It's this idea here. There is a past, and I'm indebted to it. There is a present where I fit, and I'm part of something much bigger than I am. And there's a future that my little role plays in building and setting the future for all those to come. There's all of these wonderful truths to this type of a mindset. What Truman has pointed out is that after the Enlightenment, you eliminate God, man continues to burrow into himself in these different ways. And we've outlined that through the philosophers. But the bottom line is you come up with this concept of self to where you have to break these boundaries. You have to be self-creational. You have to define the road behind you, because everything that came behind you doesn't matter. Everything that comes in front of you doesn't matter. All that matters is me today, now, and my self-creation. So that's where we left it based on those first 4 chapters. Now, what Truman is going to introduce us to today is not only has our concept of ourselves shifted from that to this, but our concept of this is changing. And we'll call this the world. Everything that has transpired up until now and everything that we're experiencing today in current time, we'll call this the world, and everything that we see and how we even view the world itself. He calls our viewpoint now, the world is plastic. And not plastic like this, but plastic like it's just stuff. You melt it down and you pour it into a mold. Any shape that you want it to be, you can pour it into, and it can be a function for you, defined by you, manipulated by you. It's all just stuff. It's all just stuff. And so our viewpoint now, not just of ourselves, but of the world as a whole, is that everything is manipulable. Everything can be crafted. Everything can be molded. Everything can be shaped according to our own will. And that's where we're going largely with this chapter. So he draws a comparison, and I'm going to have us read this again. Adam, you read it last time. Can you read it this time?
Again, like all 10 pages?
Not 10 pages. All right, it's page 93 at the bottom to 94. So it begins to clarify this. It is useful.
Clarify this. It is useful to engage in a thought experiment. If I had been born in England in the 14th century, I would have lived in a world that I would have considered stable and fixed. Wherever I was born in the social hierarchy, peasant, noble, or king, that is where I would have remained. In all likelihood, I would have been born to a family that worked the soil as peasant farmers. My career path would thus have been determined at birth. I would grow up to be a peasant farmer. My geographical placement would have been fixed as well, as travel, let alone immigration, would have been difficult and pointless. Everything I needed would have been in the village or town where I was born. I would have had a wide extended family with whose members I was familiar. I would have probably met the girl I was to marry fairly early in life. I would have been baptized, married, and buried in the same church. And my children, as well as my children's children, would have experienced much the same. My religion would not be a choice, since the Catholic Church was the only religion available in my town. And my life on an annual basis would have been shaped decisively by the rhythm of the seasons. I needed to sow my crops in the spring, not the winter, and harvest them in the autumn, not the summer, waiting for appropriate rain and sunshine in the interim. In short, my world would have been very fixed and very stable.
Thank you, that's perfect. And keep in mind, we added a couple things. We said in 1400, This was largely before the big boom when all the folks were running around on ships exploring the world. That was like 1600s, 1700s, 1800s mostly. So really people didn't travel. They didn't sail across the ocean blue. They did little hops maybe down the shore. But there really wasn't this global perspective at that time. Also, people didn't really have money. The rich people had money, but most people that lived on farms and peasantry, etc., actually having money to spend was very uncommon. They traded. People maybe had 1 or 2 pieces of clothing, 3 or 4 pieces of clothing. People didn't have horses to ride. That was very expensive. So people did everything on their own backs. Everything that was within their sphere was walking distance, usually a day, at most 2. There weren't hotels per se. There weren't restaurants per se. So it was really difficult, and there was a lot of crime. And if you didn't know people to get from A to B to C to D, you couldn't eat. You didn't know where to live, and you weren't safe until you got there. Now, that's broad generalizations, but largely that's true, right? So it was really very, very small and micro was your life. Up until about 1400s, 1500s, right in there. And then it grows broader from there. So let's go to the transition that he's talking about. Ryan, could I ask you to read 94, that next paragraph? Our world is very different.
Our world is very different. Mass transportation, migration, education, social mobility, technology, science, medicine. All of these things and more have started to make the world a much more plastic place than it was in 1400. I will look at a few specifics below, but notice here the general picture, where once the world was fixed and therefore I needed to find my place within it, a place that was itself rather fixed. Now its lack of fixity inclines me to think that the world can actually be shaped to my will. I was born the son of a small-town accountant and lived in Gloucester as a child, attending a state grammar school. But unlike my parents, I went to college, gained an undergraduate and postgraduate degree, and having worked at 4 previous institutions on both sides of the Atlantic, I am now a professor of humanities at a college in Western Pennsylvania. My fate was not set by the circumstances of my birth. The world in which I live is one that I consider to be largely the result of my own free choices. Now, immigration might not be part of everyone's experience of life, but most people in the West today think of the world as far more flexible, even fluid than anyone in 1400 would have thought. In 1400, the world seemed fixed, stable, and solid. Today, it seems as pliable as Play-Doh.
Perfect, thank you. So what we're getting at there is really what we've been illustrating here, is that really, and this is really only in the last 100 and, what are we now, 25 years or so, because we didn't have planes that could fly all over the world. And even our big boats, sometimes they would sink. They weren't incredibly safe. They were a lot safer than sailing, but even then, it was still difficult. Space travel, 1960s, incredible today. I mean, Elon Musk, we'll get to that. But that is all still really, really new. And what's interesting about that is that it is changing, and this is where he's going, it's changing the very way that we think about the world. If you go back to that 1400s man and woman, and if they wanted to go 25 miles that way, and there was several mountains in the way, they would have to climb the mountains, or find a way through, or find a path around, which made their trip even longer, because that was a geographic impediment. Or if there was a river that was, say, from here to that wall, and it was deep and it was fast, that would stop you. Just from here to that wall. That would be dangerous, life-threatening. And you'd have to find a way around it, or you'd have to find a way over it, or something. So even geographic impediments, if you're just walking or even riding a horse, were severe and significant up until just these last few centuries. So the way that we're thinking about our world continues to change. Let's continue to read. Who can I pick on? Wesley. Can I ask you to please read? See, I was at the Dalton's house yesterday, so now they're all live game. This is great. Wesley, if you would please read Mindset shift and impact, page 95 at the bottom. And where I want you to pick up is, to put it bluntly, the modern cultural imagination. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, nice and loud. I'll just stop you. Go ahead and stand up nice and loud.
To put it bluntly, modern cultural imagination sees the world as raw material to be shaped by the human will.
By the way, that word imagination, there it is. This is part of our social imaginary. I'm going to give an illustration in a minute that's going to try to flip that back. But I want you to check in with yourself and think, do I kind of see the world this way? Go ahead.
Perhaps the most important factor in shaping this has been the technology. To return to the medieval farmer, his life was utterly dependent upon the soil available in the slope, upon the rhythm of the seasons. Today, irrigation means that we can farm in the desert. Glass houses, insecticides, and fertilizers mean that the soil and the seasons lack the omnipotence that it once possessed. Nature's authority has not been eliminated, but it has been significantly mitigated.
So pause there. That last sentence is great. Nature hasn't gone away. We just recently had an example of that up here in the mountains of North Carolina. But it has been significantly mitigated. Do you see that? We can grow stuff in all seasons, and we can actually transport things from the southern half of the world, where their seasons are reversed from ours, get it here in time to still be reasonably fresh in our grocery stores. So this is changing how we think about the world. And the question is, should it? Or how do we frame it in our brain? Keep going.
The same goes for medicine. Diseases that were once dead sentences can now be addressed with simple medication. Some, like polio, have even been eradicated. And geography is no longer the force that it was. The cheap transport.
So pause there again. Medical event. We just recently had a medical event the last few years where people actually feared something they couldn't see. That was common. That was common and has been throughout history. Christians used to be known for going into those situations, but it was common. But now we are used to walking around as a world culture without fear of any disease. We really don't think about it. That's new. Go ahead.
With cheap transport, public and private, distances that were once measured in days or weeks can now be measured in hours.
That's an amazing thing, by the way. My wife and I drove through, we used to drive through the mountain ranges, and our kids would like have something in their ears, they'd be listening to something, and we're driving through a tunnel that's been bored into the base of a large mountain, snow all around us, we've got the heat on, and we're looking at the river down in the canyon going, oh, isn't that lovely? And we're through those mountains in an hour and a half. Incredible. And how often don't we think about that? It's a shift in our thinking. Go ahead. How you doing, by the way?
Good.
Good. Okay, keep going. You're doing great.
From agriculture to medicine, from automobiles to computers, technology is not simply a means of doing normal human activities with greater speed and efficiency. It changes the fundamental relationship of human beings to their environment and to each other. Neither the seasons of the year nor geography of the land are as significant as they once were. Technology shifts the balance of power from nature toward human agency and the competition between agencies.
Competition between agencies. I'm going to cover that in a minute. But thank you very much. Do you see the shift? Yes.
I just want to make a comment. What he just described is the cultural the creation mandate of man to rule the earth and subdue it. So it's not bad, but where you're going to take us is to see what the implications are, how we see ourselves.
Do you guys hear that? I'll call on you again to make sure and make it loud. But yes, that is where we're headed. For those of you over here in mystery, I'm going to leave you there. All right, good. Because that is where we're going. Way to steal my thunder, fella. All right. Now, he's going to give us a micro example of music. A micro example of music, of how our world has changed our thinking. Okay? Robert, could I ask you to read that for us? Yes. Sorry. Technology also reinforces the focus on the individual. Oh, you've got your thingy. Okay. Peggy, could I ask you? Nope, you don't have it. Okay. Mitch, perfect. Technology also reinforces. Now, this is a microscopic example of one thing But what it is Truman is trying to show us how this thing was how it always was, but how it is now and how differently we think about it. So he's trying to help us unpack our intuitions, our unthought about presuppositions. Go ahead, Mitch.
Technology also reinforces the focus on individuals and non-individual satisfaction. Take something like music, a basic part of human society throughout history across the globe. In the past, music was always a live, often communal activity. Somebody had to be playing music for it to be heard, and somebody had to be present in order to appreciate it. Now we can listen to whatever music we choose, whenever we want, and perhaps most significant of all, we can do so in privacy. Music has been transformed from something with a primary live and communal focus, live concerts, notwithstanding. It has become more commonly an item of consumption for the individual. If expressive individualism has come to a focus on a personal satisfaction and meaning of life, technology has served that cause well.
Excellent. Thank you. Does that make sense? Again, I can remember being in the famous Lund family car, and each child is listening to their different music because they can choose. There was a time way back when the kids were young where we would have to pick what we were going to listen to, and the parents were in the front and the kids were in the back, and of course they won, and we're listening to the Wiggles for hours. I had them all memorized. I think I still have them memorized. But anyway, that day is no longer. But what we're about to do, Brahman and I are actually going to be down in downtown Charlotte in a couple hours, and we're going to be singing as part of a large chorus in the Messiah, a half of a Messiah. And there'll be orchestra members in front of us and soloists and an audience, and that's old music. That's people getting together to create music. We just did that at the Daltons. Sarah was running Ryan and I through the bass part of Song of Simeon for tonight. And we were sounding good, Ryan and I, side by side yesterday, singing bass. We sounded better than that. But I want to give us a perspective. What he's trying to help us understand is how much our understanding of the world has changed. We just pull things off the shelf. We just pull things up on our phone. We just plug it into our ears. And the world feels very small in a lot of ways and very manipulable, right? It feels like we've kind of got our hands around this world. And that's why I put Elon Musk here in the current mindset. Elon Musk is like the champion of our day. That guy has a company that shoots things off into space and then comes back and actually lands. He's got a company that digs underneath the earth, the boring company, and massive tunnels, and makes them super fast. So he's like under the earth, he's on the earth, and he's above the earth. And he keeps telling us we need to go to Mars because that's the future. And he's like typical, not in a bad way, good way, just is, of our mindset today. Everything out there that is a barrier is meant to be overcome or mastered or fixed. That's what Elon Musk personifies for us. And we'll talk about whether that's good or bad in a minute. But what I want us to do is just read real quick page 96 at the bottom. And let's see. Spence. No book. Aiden, do you have a book? Oh, there we go. A book can magically appear. All right, Spence, you're up, and then Aiden, you'll be next. All right. Spence, 96, the paragraph that begins, all of these things contribute to and reinforce a cultural imagination. And again, remember, we're talking about how we now think about, oh, that picture's gone. We now think about this world that was so fixed and that was framing us and encapsulating us in so many ways. We now think about this world as a plastic place. It's something we can mold, we can shift, like Elon Musk does. And then we're going to talk in a minute about how that shapes our view of ourselves. Go ahead.
All of these things contribute to and reinforce a cultural imagination that tilts towards seeing the world simply as stuff. The future is something that we can make in whatever we desire. And nature, not so much as fixed reality, is something that is to be overcome and remade through technical mastery. as I argue in previous chapters, the modern person considers himself to be something he can create for himself, so he tends to extend that same notion to his relationship to the world in general. We no longer think of ourselves as subject to the world's fixed nature, or of it having an objective authority or meaning. We are the ones with power, and we are the ones who give the world significance.
Do you see that last, how that flows? Thank you. How that flows into our philosophers? We have the power. We give the significance. We create the meaning. And we have this sense in our heads that we're controlling the world, and we hear it all the time, both in the positive and the negative. Elon Musk is the positive, but we've got the negative. Oh, we're destroying the world. We're going to pollute the world. We're going to blow the world up. We're going to do all these things. So I wanted to give us just a little bit of perspective to kind of reset our intuitions about the world. This is the surface of the world. This is to the center of the world is 4,000 miles, roughly. To the edge of the outer atmosphere of the world. Now, our regular atmosphere is here. That's where the air is. But the world, or the atmosphere that actually moves around the Earth and impacts us all the way down here, goes out about 6,000 miles. This is the exosphere. Couple of notes. The deepest trench in the ocean, the Marianas Trench, is right here. That's 7 miles deep. That's the farthest a man has ever gone into the ocean. And that's the farthest that it goes. The tallest mountain, Mount Everest, is 5 miles high. It's right here. The deepest hole that we've ever dug is in Russia. It's 5 miles. An atomic bomb with a nuclear plume. The nuclear plume goes up about 3 miles. Does that give you some perspective? A man is 6 feet tall. I can't even draw it that small. And we don't even cover a quarter of the earth as a human being population. This is the world that we think we can control. This is the world that we're afraid we're going to blow up in our wars. Nuclear bomb. This is the world that we think we know. The deepest hole we've ever dug, the farthest we've ever gone to the center of the earth is right here. This is the world that we think we know. And this is where our satellites are. And this is the end of our exosphere. And this is where we think we're going to impact our climate. It's like opening up a soda can and tossing it into the ocean. It's actually even wilder than that from a ratio perspective. So this is hopefully giving us a perspective of resetting our imaginary, the way that we think, and just reminding ourselves through geography and through the old science of astronomy, different ratios and perspectives that we don't teach as much anymore. But we should. Particularly in relation, man, how he relates to the geography that we sit on, the world that we know, and the planetary structures and how far things are apart and all of that. And then you start to think about the God that created all of it. And it resets your perspective. Now, Adam, you had a comment just a minute ago, and if you'd stand up and project that nice and loudly, I'd appreciate it if you would repeat that comment. Yes!
So they were basically commenting with the tone of somehow this might be bad, technology improvements, enhancements, the things we've done. But that's really the creation mandate, that Adam was to rule over the earth and subdue it and make things better. Now, we're trying to figure out how that affects how we see the world now, but we are supposed to make things better. We are supposed to improve things, and that's what we have been doing. Not perfectly, but that's what we've been doing.
100%. So what we see in this world right now is people basically feeling like they are masters of the universe. But we can see through some very simple ratios how insignificant we really are and how little we really know. It's just that we don't remind ourselves of the son of a gun. We don't remind ourselves of these very often. Imagine that. But it really puts us in our place, doesn't it? So with a right perspective, which is what Adam is getting at, which is what? Stewardship. When Adam and Eve were given the world by God, he said basically, take care of this in my name. Do all you do for my glory and be thankful to me because I made it. I created it. I rule it. I hold it together by the word of my power, God says. All of these things were never meant to be taken for granted or lost in our thinking. They're never meant to be lost in our thinking. So because we are losing those things, and we're going to talk about 3 institutions that have been pillars of right thinking for most of history that have gone off the rails, in losing those from our conversation, from our thinking, we're losing this perspective, how insignificant we are, but how we fit into a much greater whole. All right, so let's keep going. That's plastic world. Yes, yes.
We didn't even know these things back several hundred years ago.
Which things?
Like all these measurements and how big everything is.
Ah.
And it's just really interesting thinking the more we know, the more we think we influence it. It should be the opposite, really. We should have more of an awe, but it's
Yes.
more like if we can understand it more, we can control it more. But we
Yep.
really should. We know more, but it doesn't mean it affects the world and how people think they can control it.
Yes. So what Sarah is saying is that back thousands of years ago, we may not have known this. I'll address that in a minute. But that the more that we know, the more we should realize we don't know, which is true. Like if you were to take my physical body at an atomic level, down to the atoms, the distance from my shoulder to my heart as a ratio might be greater than the distance from the center of the earth out to the edge of the earth. Maybe. I haven't done the math. But it's possible. And that just shows us even more about how much we don't know. Now, did we know this thousands of years ago? So we may not know 3,996 or whatever, but we had the math and we had astronomy. Egyptians knew that the world was round. Mathematicians knew a lot of things, and they had the ratios. Now, they may not have had them to the depth that we do, but they were roughly on point. And the study of astronomy was a key piece of every education for most of our world's history. Astronomy in a bunch of different ways, but in relevant ways, like mathematical ways, to show us our place in creation and in the world. So we'll leave it there. But that's a great comment. Thank you. All right, so now let's look at institutions, because that's another thing that is contributing to this idea of a plastic world, meaning we don't think this way anymore. We don't think this way anymore. Church, family, and nation. Collapse of traditional authority. It's on page 97, and he identifies the church, the family, and the nation, all 3 under attack. Okay? Let's see. Mr. Smith, you happen to have your book in your hand. If you could stand up. Page 97, the paragraph that begins, in the West, the Reformation.
In the West, the Reformation, with its fracturing of the church, is an obvious starting point for this. Where medieval Catholic Catholicism had an institutional unity which gave credence to its claims to authority, the Reformation changed all that. After Luther, the Catholic Church had competitors. At first, nations and then people in general were able to choose their religion. And as countries allowed for religious freedom, then eventually churches became competitors in the religious marketplace, competing, to put it crudely, for adherence. Thus, fundamentally transformed the dynamics of power between church authorities and congregants. Now the congregant was able to choose which church to attend, especially when the ownership of an automobile made it possible to travel to find a place of worship of one's choice.
Perfect. Thank you. So there was just one church, for the most part. One big church from New Testament forward. Then the Reformation happened, and there was a split, Western Europe. That split then splintered and became so many little fragments over the next several hundred years that it was even hard to keep track, and it certainly is hard to keep track today. In the initial splits, during the Reformation, different city-states, because they didn't really have countries like we have them today necessarily, but different city-states, different dukes or kings or lords or whatever, they would adopt as a city or as a location a religion. They were either Protestant, protesting the Catholic Church, or they were Catholic, sticking with the one church. But then even that splintered because the variations within the churches started to change. To eventually we're to the point now where if you drive through downtown Charlotte, you've got a Methodist church and a Unitarian church and a whatever church on every street corner. And because you're driving, which is a technological advancement really since the 1920s when Ford made it ubiquitous, you're driving, you can get to any church you want. You're not walking. So technology's changed that. So the church that used to be all one piece and had a lot of authority in the lives of the families that surrounded the individual parishes. Because of its consistency, its longevity, the fact that this church did all the same things as that church and that church if you were to go to different churches, that went away, which immediately caused people to question the authority of that institution. And well, they do it different across the street, so are they right or are we right? And how do we figure that out? That's a new problem in the last 500 years that we used to have. The church was the church. You went to the church, it was the church. So it's a new problem. It's a new agent in our lives, and it's reduced the authority of the church. Because if I don't agree with what this church is doing, I can go across the street. That makes sense? So that contributes to the plasticity, to the moldability of the world around us. Because here was this institution that had this authority, and it's been largely removed, largely decimated. Second one. Oh, second paragraph. Sorry, Wesley, you weren't done. 97, the next paragraph. We can add to the fragmentation. Go ahead. Stand up again nice and loud.
We can add to the fragmentation of the church and various other challenges to religious authority. The cultural despisers of religion have dominated the way which religion has been presented in art, literature, and now pop culture for many decades, making religious claims seem implausible, and religious people seem either critical, idiotic, or both. The various recent scandals that have dogged churches have far shattered their moral authority and reinforced this popular image of banality and corruption. Traditional Christianity, in particular, is now commonly viewed as connected to imperialism, racism, and hatred of minorities, covering its own hypocrisy in these areas with a language of
unctuously
of self-righteous piety.
Perfect, thank you. And what have we seen churches do? Backflips and forward flips, trying to meet the culture wherever the culture is at and not offend the culture. So that means we've got the authority, not the church, because the church isn't standing fast. If we say we want this, a month later there's a church out there saying, hey, we've got this. And that goes from there. By the way, you watch a murder mystery and there's a clergyman involved. Who did the murder? Right? I mean, come on. It's consistent. It's consistent. All right, the next one is the family. The next one's the family. Bob Cara, since you're here, could a book magically appear for Bob Cara? Page 98.
Where do you want me to start?
The paragraph that says, if the last century has been brutal. Good, thank you.
If the last century has been brutal in its effect on institutional religious authority, a similar story can be told about the traditional family. Long-standing elite critique of the family as oppressive and tyrannical has found its counterpoint in popular culture. Movies, sitcoms, and soap operas routinely present families as dysfunctional. At the same time,
Pause right there. Any sitcom over the last 30 years, you see a family. Who's the dumbest guy in the family? And who's the smartest in the family? The kids and the daughters in particular. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Dysfunctional Archie Bunker families.
Nice addition, by the way. I like the flourish. It's very good. Yeah.
At the same time, legal challenges have served to undermine traditional family structures. No-fault divorce has lowered the bar for the dissolution of marriage to nothing more than a sentimental feeling that the spouses would be happier apart than together. Again, 45th anniversary.
Woohoo!
And the widespread existence of single-parent families or of children in families blended after divorces all serve to erode the stability and the authority of the family.
Perfect. Thank you. So after 50 years of sitcom TV, by the way, how many people remember Leave It to Beaver, at least in reruns? Yes. So Leave It to Beaver, the husband was home, reasonable time. He wore a tie at home. The kids would go out and they'd all get in trouble. They'd come back. Dad would address the children. There was a moral at the end, and it concluded. And Dad was the authority. Mom and Dad had a great marriage. She always wore pearls. I actually don't know if that's true. Don't quote me. But anyway, 1950s TV into the 60s. You go up into the 70s, 80s, 90s. You've got Three's Company, what have you. It all goes drama, right? All of that undermines the authority of the family. We see families now portrayed in different stories and whatnot that are an absolute mess. Things don't get resolved. Conflict everywhere. And that's the drama. It's no longer a family facing what's going on in the world like Little House on the Prairie, like that old TV show. They were facing whatever came at them together. And they would work it out together. Now it's the families themselves are the problem. And they're facing themselves together and trying to sort through things. Largely, this is broad generalizations, but largely that's the case. So again, we have all of these communication channels, and of course this is just on steroids now with social media, etc. All of these communication channels in all these different ways forming our intuitions about family, about patriarchal structure, about authority. Where do we go for guidance? Where do we go for wisdom? Where do we go for strength? Where do we go to know where we fit in? And all of that continues to be eroded. And then the last one is our country. So you think about, and I've just got a few notes on this, then we're going to go to page 100. The idea of our country. So countries are relatively new. Empires are not. We can go into the Old Testament. You see the empire of Assyria, the empire of Babylon, empire of Egypt, etc. Traditionally, what that's comprised of is a nation, a city-state, some powerful area ruled by a king or a pharaoh or an emperor or whatever it is, some link to a divine right to be that. So they were authorized. And then they would go running around and conquering everything around them. So all of these other things would be, all of these other city-states would get subjugated and conquered. And it would go back and forth, like Babylon lost for a while to the Medes and the Persians, and then they beat them. And then the Medes and the Persians ate them back up again. It was back and forth. Sorry, that was Assyria, Babylon, Medes and Persia. Anyway, it was all just all over the place. But there was a certain stability to that. I am of Rome. I am of Babylon. This is my country. I will die for my country. I will die for the empire. And that, even up into the 1800s, and you see Britain conquering the world in the 1700s, 1800s, and planting the flag in the U.S., in India, in all over the world for king, for country. I told Brahman the other day, I read these books, Master and Commander books. I brought them once. They stand about this high. But anyway, on these little boats, these tiny, tiny little boats, picture this, like a tiny, tiny little boat sailing on the ocean. Nothing. These men would be in broadcloth uniforms for a particular weekly meal, and that was a formality they observed. And then at the end of that meal, they would all stand up in the middle of the ocean, middle of a boat. They would all stand up and toast the king and remind themselves the authority under which they sailed and that they were part of something bigger than themselves. and that they had a purpose. They were ridding the world of pirates, or they were feeding a colony, or they were taking something back from the colony to the home and the motherland, or whatever they were doing. They fit in and they had purpose, they had meaning, and it didn't matter where in the world they were, they kept that meaning and that structure and that purpose and those uniforms, even in a tropical climate. Picture English wool, broadcloth, tropical climate, crazy. But they did it because that was part of who they were. So what we have now with nations in the westernized world is very new. And the U.S. is probably the biggest first example of this. This idea that people would gather together under a set of truths, and then that we have individual rights that we can actually exercise against our own state. And yes, we can be patriotic and we can do all those things, but we hold these truths to be self-evident that man was given these inalienable, can't take them away, rights by God. And then we vote on who rules us. That is extremely new. But then you think about what that does to your brain. We no longer have a divine ruler. We don't have a king with a long line that goes back into history. Now we're a people, and we've agreed to live under these truths. And then we are the ones that are the country, and the politicians work for us. By the way, none of this is wrong. This is true. But see how it changes your brain. And then the idea of dying for king and country, well, we don't have a country anymore, and then we don't have a king anymore, and the country now is just people. And we may not even like the people that we live next to. Will I die for you? Do you see the difference? How that shifts? A lot of things that held us together or gave us stability, I wrote some down here, are disappearing. Ethnicity used to be a big deal. Oh, we're in Japan. We're the nation of Japan. How do we know? Well, we look Japanese. We're Indian. We live in India. How do we know? Well, we look different from them. China, Korea, Anglo-Saxon, Nordic. I'm 6'3" and I have blonde hair and blue eyes. I'm stereotyping. But that's the idea. That's largely going away. And where is that going? It's going away through intermarriage and immigration. Intermarriage and immigration. Immigration at the level that we have it now is new, with planes and big boats that are actually really safe, and educational institutions that take people all over the world and then ship them back or don't ship them back. So all of those ethnic pieces that used to hold us together, even those are going away. And now we've got interracial marriages with kids that are all a mix. Even that's going away. So then you start to ask yourself the question, well, who am I? Who am I? I can't ground myself in my race or in the way that I look. I can't ground myself necessarily in my country because my country is volunteer. And if I don't like it here, I'll go across to a different country and become a citizen there. All of these things that used to hold us together are fluid or plastic. Does that make sense? So all of that is shifting. Now, let's go to the top of page 100, and we'll wrap this up. Aiden, can I pick on you? Top of 100. And he begins at the top there. It says, start with shorn of such external markers. And the external markers he's talking about are the things that we just discussed. Like we used to be able to unite together and say, oh, we're British, or oh, we're Japanese, or oh, we're Indian. We can't even do that anymore. Go ahead.
Shorn of such external markers, the turn inwards gains yet more momentum. To this we might add the observation of Yuval Levin concerning the reversal in the understanding of the purpose of institutions that characterizes our present age. We have moved, roughly speaking, from thinking of institutions as molds that shape people's characters and habits towards seeing themselves as platforms that allow people to be themselves and to display themselves before a wider world.
So we'll pause there real quick. Do you remember we used to say things like, well, we'll send the kid to college and that'll straighten him up. That'll teach him to be a man or a woman, that can go out into the world. We'll send him to college. Or we'll put him in the military. And that'll get him going, right? Or the church. We're going to raise our kid up in the church, and then that'll ensure that the kids have a good, strong moral foundation. Which church? Go ahead.
We can express this more bluntly. Institutions are no longer authoritative places of formation, but of preference.
Performance.
Performance. As with my earlier observation about the world shifting in the modern mind from a place of fixity to a place of plasticity or liquidity, so we see this shift in institutions too. And this all connects to the notion of the self-articulated thinkers discussed earlier in this book. And when we once more add to this the matter of technology, specifically such things as Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, we find that notion of life as public performance being further reinforced. Everybody can be an Oscar Wilde today, though generally without his wit and sophistication. And institutions have become party to this. Keep going.
No, that's good. Perfect. Thank you. So what we've got there, and we'll conclude with this just slightly early, which is fine. The institutions that used to be anchors for us, for purpose, for meaning, for our place in life, that used to shape and mold us, are now basically platforms or stages that we would walk onto and express ourselves. So the churches that are very forward on the LGBTQ, I go to that church because I can be myself, because I can express my true individuality, truly who I am. Or the churches that are focused on the climate. We had one in Newport Beach, a church that was very into the climate and saving the world. And I go there to express my compatibility, my vision of saving the world. And that's my Christian outflow. That's who I am as a believer. That's what God gives me as a mission in life. Not God defined, I define. So the institutions then really, they're still there, but they're now something for us to step into to express ourselves through. They're nothing more than an organ for us to blow air into to make our own music. The other thing about social media that's unique, and this is still very new, it allows us to reach everywhere around the world to find people that want to align with us in whatever we think is who we are as ourselves. And in no way that we've had up until this point are we able to so quickly and so easily find a community as we are now. A community based on our thoughts, based on what we think. And there's nowhere in social media that you can go where there isn't a group somewhere that says, hey, yeah, this is the right answer. This is awesome. This is who we are. So it's not right or wrong on social media. What I'm saying is that it just gives us a very unique and new way to do what we've always done, which was make ourselves gods and ignore these types of realities and allow us to kind of consider ourselves or to think of ourselves as formulating ourselves. So that's just new. What we need to do, and we talked about this a little bit under Elon Musk, but what we need to do is get back to the idea of we are stewards of this earth. Every piece of technology that we have is given to us by God or allowed by God through inventors, whatever, but it's to be used for His glory. Social media is to be used for His glory. Technology to be used for His glory. Going to the moon to be used for His glory. I don't know how, but everything that God allows us to do and everything that we create is underneath His sovereign headship and is to be used for His glory. Now that's where we're going to end up in the later chapters of this book. It's out of Revelation. It's the little lampstands. I'm giving away the end of the book. It's the little lampstands, the churches that are proclaiming the gospel everywhere they go. Everything is underneath that rubric. So I'll take any questions that we've got. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. Any questions, comments?
What are we reading next week?
Thank you. Yes, chapter 6. Chapter 6, because we have finished chapter 5. What's that? Oh, good point. All right, so we're going to be going on to chapter 6, but for the next 2 weeks, we don't have Sunday school, right? Okay.
Can I have a longer sermon then next week?
Yes, you may. Wait, is that right? The 22nd? It's what we've announced? Okay. That's what we announced. Very good. All right. Travis, would you close us in prayer, brother?
Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the world that you've created for us and the fact that we know that you are sovereign in it, and the peace and surety that that gives us in our spirit. Lord, we ask that you would continue to give us that in a world that is often chaotic and rooting against us, rooting against you, and give us the peace that we know that you are the champion at the end of the day. We thank you for the lesson today and Jason's teaching. Thank you for Dr. Kara and the sermon. We ask that you would go with us and bring us back this evening. In Jesus' name we pray.
So our next Sunday school will be in January. That makes it easy.